All right, well, it is 12 o'clock on the dot, so let's go ahead and get started. Other folks that are joining here, they'll be able to see the first part of the presentation as it will be recorded. First off, just want to thank everyone for joining us for the Annie's presentation on addressing best practices. My name's John Green. I'm one of the business development managers here at DATAMARK, also one of the GIS subject matter experts. Before we begin, we want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. Again, as I mentioned, this presentation is being recorded. We're going to save questions, Q&A, till the end, but as we go through the presentation there, please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions. And I'll as moderator, I'll be monitoring that chat window. And if there's a burning question, I may even interrupt Annie to ask it real quick. Otherwise, we'll save those questions till the end, and we'll address those towards the end of the presentation. So I would like to introduce Annie Cahill, our team here at Data. She's one of our addressing experts. And Annie, I'll let you tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, everyone. So I'm Annie Cahill, and I've been with DATAMARK for a little over 3 years. My background is I'm GIS nerd. I worked in local government GIS for about 15 years before coming to DATAMARK. So I have a lot of experience with address management, with GIS, with local government stuff. And for DATAMARK, I actually run all of our strategic planning services. I also run all of our boundary facilitation services. I also do education and webinars, and I'm sure some of you guys have been with me before. So drop in the chat if you guys have seen any of my webinars before, or if you are kind of familiar with what we do, or is this kind of like your first time here? Okay. And I'm asking because I'm trying to figure out what nerdy, awkward thing I want to say this time to just kind of get it out of the way, Oh, I am so grateful that you guys are with me today. I really appreciate it. And I'm always happy to chat with you guys. If you have ever sent me an email about something and I haven't responded, oh yeah, Annie who, thanks. Okay, Greg, I see you. But sometimes you guys will email me, and I get tons and tons and tons of emails. So if you have my phone number, that's probably the better way to reach me. It's just one of those things. I get inundated in emails every day. So, but I'm so happy to be here with you today to talk about addressing and to have these discussions. And I kind of started off with like, have you been with me before? Because I had joked around earlier that I wanted to start off with like a Jaws thing. If you've ever seen Jaws, you know how Quint's like, he goes into the town meeting and he's like, y'all know me, you know how I earn a living. But okay, see, I told you it had to be something weird. It was either going to be that or something from The Office. So I was going to open with like, which bear is the best bear? So you can drop that in the chat if you're an Office fan. All right, so today we're going to talk about best practices for addressing, specifically for NG 911, okay? And this is kind of our agenda for the day. We are going to go over the history and legacy, addressing for public safety, best practices, the role of the addressing authority, and the path forward. So the history and legacy. So the origins of addressing are really interesting. It really kind of originated with landmarks, right? So you would say to somebody, hey, I'll meet you at the Fox and Hound pub, or turn left at the Windy Mermaid and then right at the Broken Wagon. Incidentally, a lot of old plats and deeds are like that too. It's like take 10 paces toward the old oak tree and hang a left, but in a lot more old-timey language than that. So anyway, and then over time, we saw that addresses kind of evolved to be more specific for things like the census. So when the enumerator comes to take the census, we need a more specific way of tying people to a location, right? So we saw kind of this evolution of addressing for census, conscription, and of course, tax collection. So nowadays, we see that addressing it kind of permeates every aspect of our lives, okay, especially for things that concern us, right? Like mail. I really should have put Amazon at the top of the list for myself because I might have a little bit of a problem. Pizza delivery, very important to me when I'm disregarding carbs. Obviously, things like school bus pickup, utilities, anything having to do with mail, and then of course public safety. And really, it's at the bottom of the list. It should be at the very top. But hopefully and thankfully, most of us don't really need to call 911 on a regular basis, but we do need to receive our mail on a regular basis. So that's why things like addresses are so important to us, because that's the connection, right? We're making that connection with something that we use on a regular basis. So really, a lot of things have shaped the way that our addressing systems look today, okay? And a lot of that has to do with the age of your community. Where I live is about 300 years old, so we have a lot of weird stuff. But a lot of things can shape the way that your addressing systems look. So boundaries between jurisdictions, especially if you have annexations, if you have changes in your addressing grid, sometimes, you know, an addressing system may have started with a really small area, but because of expansion, maybe the origin point that's used for the addressing system is not appropriate anymore. So maybe a pre-directional that was once used is not appropriate, and now you have to kind of go back to the drawing board. Additionally, you have situations where addressing authorities didn't always have the right information to assign the address, right? So they may have missed an access way or right of way. There may have been more lots than anticipated, or there may have only been one lot, but then they didn't leave enough space for growth, right? So that's a very real thing that we come across. And then of course, a lack of ordinances or SOPs. A lot of times the state of your addressing, the way that it looks currently, is because that foundation is missing for a lot of you, okay? And I don't mean a lot of you, I'm just saying in general, for a lot of folks, their addressing ordinances are, you know, if they know where they are, generally they're from like the 80s or early 90s, and often there are no formally documented SOPs. So drop in the chat for me if you guys have problems with your addressing systems right now. Oh, hi, Jared. So tell me some things that are going on in your community right now that are kind of your pain points, and where are you located? Just kind of curious. Yeah, updated ordinances, that's a really big deal for a lot of folks. So the current state of things is that often the addressing is determined locally, and we say for better or worse because it really is for better or worse. Some people who have well-documented ordinances and SOPs and who follow them are probably going to have a better grip on their addressing than people who have had to change addressing authorities within their governments on multiple occasions. Maybe multiple hands have been in the data. You know, maybe Lester in Public Works assigns addresses sometimes, but then Willie over in planning assigns them the rest of the time. It really just depends, and we've seen it a lot of different ways. You can often end up with a patchwork of addressing systems. So where I used to work many years ago, at my county, I believe in the 80s, they had, I think it was 4 different addressing systems in use at one time. A lot of folks still, and I'm not saying just citizens, but even a lot of people in local government believe that addressing is a responsibility of the USPS, or even worse, if they assign the address, then they will actually run it by the USPS to make sure it's correct. And that's like the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night as a former addressing authority. It really should just be one way, like you assign the address and distribute to the USPS. I wouldn't ask them for any input. There are often no standards or systems of record for addressing, especially in communities where you don't see GIS being used. or you don't have addressing kind of supporting larger enterprise systems. Often it's kind of like written on a piece of paper, or maybe it's entered into an Excel document. So you can deal with things like missing addresses. And then of course, disparity in resources really goes back to what type of resources are available to you to manage that address information. There's a lot of stuff coming in the chat. Let me look. Oh, wow. Oh, hi, Mary. I'm seeing all these people I know. Yeah, thanks guys for the chat. I love this. I love when the chat gets really active, even though I'm over here talking and doing all the boring stuff. So let's talk about addressing for public safety. The important thing to understand, like what we may associate with an address, okay, I live in a house that has an address, okay, but when it comes to public safety, anything could potentially be what's called a dispatchable location, all right? So think about a new community, homes that are being built. When someone is on that site and they're doing work before there's ever a house built, guess what? It's a dispatchable location, okay? So we have to start thinking about things like that. What about things that don't have an actual numbered location, like the Statue of Liberty? Okay, what about things in your area that are points of interest that don't necessarily have a number tied to it and a street name, but it's a commonplace area, or it's a point of interest that may not have an address tied to it. So we have to kind of think outside the box a little bit when we're talking about addressing for public safety. So what we have to do here is we have to create rules and guidelines that ultimately support our first responders. Okay, we want our addressing system to be easily understood and easily comprehended when an emergency responder is heading out to an incident. Okay, it has to be logical and consistent, and obviously you want it to be easy to update and maintain. All right, and we do see in some communities different addressing systems are applied, and a lot of time that's based on the geography, right? So you have a grid-based system in maybe like a downtown or more urbanized area, and then as you go farther out in the community, things are more rural, and so it might be appropriate to use more of a distance-based addressing system. So in the chat, let me know if you guys are using, do you know what addressing system you're using? And are you using multiple addressing systems in your community? Yeah, zip codes. Zip codes are a really big deal because they're not authoritative, right? And they can kind of change, and they don't always adhere to our jurisdictional boundaries. So that's a really good point, and that can cause a problem. So you guys talk amongst yourselves, and I'm going to keep going because we have a lot of slides, right? So again, we have the grid-based system where you kind of have block numbers. We have that in the town where I live or where I used to work. There's also the distance-based, which is better for more rural communities. You have a combination of grid and distance-based, and then the very scientific winging it, which is how I like to refer to it. That's basically you go out, oh, a new house is being built here. Here's 107, here's 113. Let's make this one 109. So it's more of like interpolation. So how are addresses used in public safety? Well, they're actually used in a lot of different ways. And, you know, without making this an NG911 discussion, I will say that in NG911, addresses become very important, and they're used before the call comes into the PSAP. They're used at the very beginning of the call instead of at the end for reference. So that's kind of like the biggest difference when we start talking about the importance of addresses to NG911. But there are lots of different systems that are supported by addresses. So you obviously have CAD systems, you have your 911 mapping, you have AVLs. There's also for NG911, there's the geospatial call routing aspect. And then of course, all of your other things that support public safety, like crime analysis and so forth. So what are some common addressing challenges? And I think I saw something in the chat, somebody had mentioned driveways, but yes, in rural areas where you have those really long driveways, if you're not careful, you can often assign an incorrect address if you're not entirely sure about where that driveway is located, okay? And I had kind of an idea for that for some of you guys. How to assign address ranges and manage those. Do we want to use actual ranges? Do we want to use theoretical? the answer is it depends. Okay, so in more urbanized areas where you have blocks, a theoretical range works okay. You could say, okay, this is the 100 block, this is the 200 block. But in rural areas, or I'm sorry, in urbanized areas, actual ranges, wait, I'm getting it reversed. Yeah, actual ranges are good for rural areas, and theoretical ranges are good for urbanized areas. So actual ranges would be, you know, if you have 100 to 139, for example, whereas a theoretical range would be you're kind of encompassing that whole block number or that whole block range. Compact address ranges, that really affects your infill addressing. Again, the community where I live is 300 years old and we have to do half addresses. So can you only imagine the nightmare that we have with that? It's not fun. Of course, annexations add a little bit of spice to the situation, because annexations, especially when the area that you're annexing is in a different numbering system, that can always become a little bit challenging too. And how do we handle that? Multi-structure and sub-addressing is something that is very mismanaged in general. And I've talked to a lot of localities who have said our two biggest issues are sub-addressing and how to handle that. And then also where you are an addressing authority for a county and you have smaller municipalities that are their own addressing authorities, and they're not communicating those addresses to you, but you're dispatching resources into their communities, right? So you could be missing information, or they could be kind of like going off and doing their own thing without talking to you first. That's a really big deal. A lack of public safety engagement in the addressing process. And then of course, like we've mentioned before, a lack of GIS resources. So these are all different challenges. So what are some challenges that you guys experience with your addressing system, or just in the addressing process in general? These are great chats. I'm just looking through all these. Yeah, sub-addressing is an issue. Yep. Yes, mobile home parks, sub-addressing. See? Oh, having to change. Has anyone ever had to go through a large readdressing effort where you've had to readdress whole streets or multiple streets or an area of your community? And how did that go? Some people have had greater success than others. You know what's funny is my boss where I used to work in the county where I was, he was so funny, and he had been there since the 80s. And when we had files on everything, and when the county went through their readdressing effort in the 80s, he created this form, and the header said blood, sweat, and tears because he would always have to take these calls from these angry people. And in one circumstance, a guy had sent all of his mail into the county and said, you deal with this, right? Because you're making me change my address, so you deal with this. So I think a lot of it is about the approach. Yeah, U-shaped subdivisions. Yeah, so a lot of really good discussion in here. Goodness gracious. Y'all, we almost need like a support group for addressing managers, right?
Readdressing for sure.
Yeah.
A readdressing support group.
This is heavy. I feel like I'm going through it right now, reading some of this stuff. Yeah, it's a lot. Well, I want to say you all are doing a good job. And if you feel like you need help, that's why we're here, right? So, you know, please feel free to reach out. Okay, so let's talk about some best practices, because I feel like we can discuss some things that can really help you guys with mitigating some of these challenges that you're experiencing. So for naming roads, okay, what you want to do is maintain a master road name list. And I'm a big proponent for open data. I understand that a lot of counties do things differently, okay, and you know, this is not about whether or not to charge for your data, okay, but I'm all about make your job easier by making things more accessible to people. So I feel like if you maintain a master road name list, you should put that online, especially if you're in an area that experiences a lot of development. That way, a developer, when he comes into planning or wherever he's going to go to request that road name, you can say, hey, we have a list online. You need to double check your road name with what we have online. And that way you're not even going through that process of having to review that plan initially, when you already know, well, we can't accept Elm Street. Okay. Should I do the Freddy Krueger thing? I won't. Okay. So then also I recommend including public safety in that road naming or approval process. It's very important to loop your public safety in because, believe it or not, road naming, addressing, all of that affects public safety. Okay. I would highly recommend implementing a policy within your office, your addressing office, that whenever you have 2 or more structures that share a right of way, to name that right of way. Okay. And the reason is because, especially for more rural areas where you've got those larger lot subdivisions that can be further broken down and sold off to people and they can build, you don't want to set yourself up for an addressing shortage, which we've seen happen. Okay. Because then you do have to do a readdressing effort. And what's worse, having to change one person's address or 2 people's address or 6 people. So just kind of look at it from that perspective. I would avoid names that sound phonetically similar or names that are just outright duplicates, names that are abbreviated, names with punctuation, and then I also would avoid directionals. Now that can be very, that can be kind of controversial because I know some people really rely on their directionals, but I'm a strong believer that if you have truly unique road names, you don't need to have directionals. But again, it's all based on your addressing system and what your public safety people are comfortable with. Okay. I just had a really good conversation with a client a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about this project where they currently have an addressing system, but because of development, that addressing system really is not applicable to what else is going on in the county, just geographically. There's just a lot that's going on. And so we talked to the public safety folks about it, and we said, hey, do you guys need the directionals? And they said, no, we don't. So, you might be surprised at what can happen when you just bring other people in on that conversation. I would also avoid names that are controversial, names that are political, names that are business names, things of that nature. I've seen that kind of go sideways. And I have a lot of stories about that, but none that I really want to record here. So anyway, there's a lot of colorful people in communities that can come up with very colorful names for things. I'm sure that you guys have experienced that. Okay, so when it comes to addressing, my recommendation is to assign numbers to all inhabited structures, but like we talked about before, you don't have to stop there. Okay, you can really, but we also don't want you to feel like you have to over address. So it's, you kind of have to strike this balance based on your resources. For corner lots, I would assign those based on the front door. Okay, especially if there's a garage involved, because first responders are not going to go through your garage; they're going to come through your front door. So we know on a lot of corner lots, you have the address or the front door faces one street, the driveway comes off another with the garage entrance. So just be mindful about that. Also consider future development when you are assigning your numbers. Okay, and then manage subaddresses. Now that's kind of a loaded bullet point there. Manage subaddresses can be very challenging. Okay, and we will talk about that here in a second. Things to avoid: street numbers longer than 6 characters. When someone is calling 911, they are often frantic, and it's very difficult to remember number strings when you're in a frantic situation and you're trying to get help. So just kind of simplify things, not only for your citizens, but also for your emergency responders, and don't go past that 6-character limit. Avoid fractionals if you can. Alphanumerics, and the reason is because a lot of people write their numbers differently, which can be very difficult to read on mail or on structures. So just be advised about that. And then hyphenated addresses. And a lot of the hyphenated stuff comes in with your mail, but I've also seen where people are assigning hyphenated numbers, and you definitely want to avoid that as well. So let's talk about the GIS management aspect, because That is very important because we know that in NG 911, GIS is really going to be the star of the show. And you as GIS folks, if you're in the chat or in the meeting, are going to be geospatial first responders. Okay, we've talked about that before. So when you go to manage your road center lines in GIS, you want to make sure that the geometry, that is the shape, and the attributes, which is the information behind the geometry, is reflecting real world information. Okay, it should be as close to real as possible. You want to make sure that when you are managing those attributes that you parse them into separate fields for the best practices for data management, and that's for the GIS data model as well. You want to make sure that you're splitting and snapping your road center lines and intersections and boundaries. Yes, you do need to split your road center lines at boundaries, because often with boundaries, you have name changes, right? You have ESN changes. And again, you want those road center lines to reflect the same information as your boundaries. Okay, we can't just look at a road center line as a road center line. We have to look at it as it's encompassing the range of the address points that are around it. It's also encompassing the community information, the zip code information, the ESN information, all of the information that's included in that data model that pertains to boundaries. So it is important to do that as well. You want to digitize in the direction of travel, which becomes important when you're trying to create a routable data set. And then I always tell people to avoid paper streets in your master, and paper streets are roads that are platted but not built, okay, or planned but not developed yet. Okay, and I always say to avoid those because sometimes they never get built. And if it's in there as a real road center line, then that can cause some problems for public safety as well. Again, for address points, you want to make sure that the geometry and the attributes are reflecting what's really going on. And that means you have to take a look at the accuracy versus the precision, and we'll talk about that more here in a second. Again, with the parsing, you have to parse those individual elements into separate fields, and that's for the civic location data exchange format that occurs in NG 911. It's that exchange of information that occurs between the call and the GIS data. You want to use consistent placement methodology, okay? And I am not telling you there's a wrong way or a right way. There are better ways of doing things, but the best guide that I can refer you to is the NENA informational document. It's not a standard, it's an informational document called the Development of Site Structure Address Points for GIS data, okay? And that's going to have a lot of really, really good information in it for how to manage or how to use consistent placement methodologies. And then of course, manage your subaddresses. We'll talk about that more here too. So when we talk about placement methodologies, there are a lot of different ways of placing your addresses. And a lot of this is just, it's kind of like historic, you know, like a lot of folks will jump into an address management role or GIS role, and they'll kind of do things the way that they've always been done, or they're placing them a certain way to support a specific business need. I just glitched. That was funny. So you can use geocoding, where you actually place the address. The address is actually geocoded based on the road range. Okay. There's parcel centroids. There's site placement. So like you're just kind of placing it in a general area of a location, like a ball field within a park, etc. You can place it on a structure or on top of the building footprint. And then also there's property access placement. So you may see address points placed at the entrance of a property. So go ahead and drop in the chat. If you guys know what your placement methodology is, just drop that in the chat. Thank you, Scott, for dropping that in there.
These are also great chats here.
On the structure, yeah. Parcel centroid, okay. Yeah. Good. Okay, good. So when we talk about placement methodologies, this table actually comes directly from that site structure address point placement document. Okay, so what this document does is it breaks down. Now this is just for public safety. Okay, this is not talking about any of your other business needs in your county, any of your enterprise systems, any of that stuff. This is just for public safety. So it looks at the different methodologies of address point placement and their suitability based on the type of business need for public safety. So for NG911 location validation and call routing, we can see that geocoding and property access is not the best. And 1 star means it's not the best, and 3 stars mean it's better. Okay, it's not wrong. It's just that some are better than others for these different business needs. Okay, so you can see here that, for example, for vehicle routing, property access is actually the best. Okay, but for NG911 call location and routing, the property access is not. So it really depends on the business need. So when we talk about rural areas and how do we handle that, my recommendation is always to develop, if you have a lot of really long driveways in a rural area, my recommendation is always to create a separate feature class or shapefile, if you guys are still managing your data in files, and create a feature class that has just those access points. Okay, and this becomes especially important for rural properties that have multiple access points. You know, one might be paved, one might be a dirt road. Like, think about a farm and all of the different ways that you can get into a farm, right? You might have a gated entrance. So there's a lot of information that you could include in that file. But that's one of the things, if you're looking at transitioning to a structure-based placement, I always like to recommend to create a separate file for access points, anything to support your first responders. So now let's talk about subaddressing. I think we all kind of know what this is, right? Subaddressing basically pertains to anything where you have one structure or multiple structures and multiple addresses. Okay, so it could be anything like a campus, a health complex, nursing home, mobile home park, some of you mentioned in the chat, shopping center complexes, etc. So there's lots of different types of potential subaddressing areas. So there are a lot of challenges with subaddressing, as you may be aware. Number one is inconsistent addressing. So this is for the addressing authority. Okay, so from a subaddressing perspective, you do have a lot of challenges. So not only is it often inconsistent, but do I have enough addresses? Do I have enough to address all of these structures in this shopping complex? Should I even assign an address to each of these? You know, should I do individual addresses versus assigning unit numbers or something like that? Having that documented in your SOPs, in your ordinances, how do we handle this? And then having a good workflow or communication, or maybe in your community, you might assign the primary, but somebody else assigns the sub. Okay, that's also been kind of a pain point for some of our clients, right? So they say, well, you know, we assign the primary, but then we let the developer assign the sub addresses, or, you know, that's handled by another department who handles the subs. That also keeps me up at night, because, you know, how do we ensure that everything is being consistent, right? So from the GIS perspective, how do we place sub addresses? Because gosh, if you have a building that's got 12 potential sub addresses, how do we place those? And then what level of detail should we use to manage the attributes? And then of course the issues with data quality. How can we ensure that there are no duplicates? From a public safety perspective, resource routing is a challenge, as well as responder safety. Okay, we also know for a fact that you can experience delayed response time. We're currently working on a project in a county now that responds to a college campus, and the college campus uses one address for like 50 buildings. And unfortunately, within their CAD system, they're unable to make a distinction between the different buildings. So everything that comes in is under one address. Well, what ends up happening is you get people responding to an incident on the campus, they have to call back into the PSAP to find the specific location of the emergency. Often they're carrying paper maps with them. So how do you think that goes, right? It's very inefficient. And we know that seconds matter when it comes to public safety. Okay, so a lot of issues from a public safety perspective. So a lot of these screenshots came out of that site structure address point placement document, which is, again, it's not a standard, it's an informational document. Okay, so one of the things that that a lot of us struggle with are apartment complexes, and these are two examples from that informational document. So the example on the left is saying, well, you can use kind of like a parcel centroid approach, right? Again, accuracy versus precision. So it's accurate to have one address there on the property, but it's not precise because you're not effectively addressing every single building there on that parcel. Okay, on the right, we're getting a little bit better. We're giving each building its own address, but it's actually the same thing. So we would need to go down into the subaddressing and say, okay, we're going to give this building numbers and then apartment numbers off of that. My preference is, and my recommendation would be, to assign every single building here a unique number and then assign subaddresses to the apartments within. How would you guys handle this? Okay, Christine. Let's look at another example. So a business complex, it's the same thing. And I see this a lot, right? The example on the left, you have, an industrial complex or commercial complex that has one address. You may have suite numbers posted on the doors. Whether or not that's managed in the GIS is beyond me. Sometimes it varies. When I first got to the city where I worked, they actually had one address point, but they had a field within the address points that said, like, I don't know what it was, apartments or something like that, or units, and it would have a note like 8 apartments or suites 1 through 4. It was very, very inconsistently managed, which is very common. On the right is a better example, but again, my preference would be to give each one a unique number, because it looks like those are 3 structures that could have their own entrances and therefore would qualify for 3 individual addresses. And then finally, the mobile home park example, and I know a lot of you have talked about this in the chat, and through your strategic planning processes, I've talked to a lot of you where this has been a real issue. Okay, so for a mobile home park, my recommendation is to name those streets. Get in there, name the streets, and give each mobile home its own individual number. That would be my recommendation. Okay, you could take the example on the right and then assign subs off of each one. But if you have a standard in place that says 2 to 3 or more on a right of way should get its own road name, then why not? Because it's very challenging. If you think about it from a first responder perspective, it's very challenging to drive into a place like this, especially if the addresses are posted, and rely on what's posted to get you where you need to go. So that's why streets and street names and street signs become very important for examples like this. Yeah, you could do an RV park the same way. If the lots stay consistent, you could just have each one numbered and then have the streets labeled or named within the RV park. Sorry, I know you guys are putting so many comments in there, I just can't keep up. And then of course an apartment complex, what a nightmare. That I would name those roads. I would name those roads and give each complex building its own number and then assign subs off of that. Now, I think, is it the next slide? No, it's another business park. Okay, so yeah, the same thing. I would name, or I would individually number each of these buildings. If you don't have enough addressing, then you may want to consider a name if there's a good right of way in through here that you could name, just to give you a little bit more space. And then, yeah, the university college campus example is a big deal as well. So I just kind of explained that example to you that we're working with currently with the county and a college to get that situated. And that's actually been a really cool project. Okay, so let me take a look at the questions. We have like 20 minutes left. There's a lot. Okay.
And hey guys, just to kind of keep the Q&A clean, if you guys don't mind, could you use the Q&A function down there? I may have told you wrong at the beginning of the presentation. That's on me. That's my fault. But if you have questions for Annie, use the Q&A, and it kind of keeps it separate from the chat, and it'll help us monitor those questions a little bit better.
So from the addressing authority perspective, you know, the local standards are always kind of like a derivative of what the national standards are. Okay, and you know, you can't always take one approach just because it works for this county or it works at the national level, then we have to apply it, right? You kind of have to work with what you have unless you're willing to go through a county-wide readdressing effort. Okay, so you do want to consider a regionalization of your addressing standards. And it's always nice when you have municipalities and counties that can kind of get together on the same page, but that's kind of like a blue sky scenario. That's often not how it works. It's oftentimes you have 4 or 5 cities, they're all on their own addressing systems and they're all kind of doing their own thing. Then there's the county, and the county might annex, and you've got multiple addressing systems going on. So again, you kind of have these challenges, and you have to think about what are the best ways to mitigate these issues. Okay, so one of the things I like to recommend is to establish an addressing review committee, or like an E911 or NG911 working group with your different stakeholders. Okay, so this can be anyone who's involved in the addressing process. So it could be like your planning and zoning, it could be public safety, GIS, could be your municipalities. I always recommend setting something up like that because it gets everybody to the table, it gets people talking. They are often not easy conversations to have, guys. Okay, I had a conversation not that long ago that was very uncomfortable, but it was because addressing had been done a certain way for such a long time. But other people were saying, hey, this is not working. We need to have more involvement from public safety. And it was just, it was a very spirited conversation, but I think at the end of the day, it was very eye-opening. And a lot of that comes back to education, right? So it's difficult to take people who are very disconnected from public safety and tell them that what they're doing isn't meeting public safety needs. You have to kind of bridge the gap somewhere. So you have to take an educational approach in a lot of ways. And then again, establishing those ordinances and SOPs become very, very important. So your ordinances should establish your addressing authority. Who is that? And what is their specific responsibility? Any requirements for addressing and road naming, standards and requirements for your signage, and then what is the enforcement process? We had it very, very detailed where I worked. And then the SOPs. The SOPs ultimately should support the ordinances. Okay, the SOPs are where you're going to document that full process from the time the request is initiated all the way through when it crosses through the different departments, when it gets entered into the GIS, when it gets distributed, the different systems that the data is provisioned to. All of that stuff should be documented in your SOPs. Okay. So let's talk about the path forward. Risk mitigation involves a proactive approach. Okay, it's saying, look, we are aware that there are issues, and we need to do things to address those issues and to mitigate future risk. Okay, so I know for a lot of people, there is this kind of like let sleeping dogs lie mentality, but when it comes to public safety, um, stories are very impactful, and people do die as a result of improper addressing, data management. There's one locality with whom we are working now, and someone died as a result of how their data was being managed. So it is a real thing that happens. And so we do need to be proactive. You don't want to wait until something happens and then, your community ends up on the news as being one of the ones that, had a problem or whatever. You don't want that to happen. Okay. You do want to implement a strategy for data management and communication and create a quality assurance culture. That's very, very important. And it does involve, like I said, a lot of talks, a lot of uncomfortable conversations, everybody sitting at the table to kind of work this out and get on the same page. It's not always easy, okay? But the work is very, very important. So what your QA is going to do is enforce your best practices that you're putting into place. And what you're also going to do is, like I said, you're going to engage those stakeholders, okay? So who manages the data, who's consuming the data, what people are touching that data, and ultimately how is that data going to be used in 911 and in those different systems, and what improvements do we need to make to those workflows so that we have an efficient method of getting that data there. Understanding the 3 business day rule that's going to be coming with your next generation core services provider. So when an anomaly is identified through the spatial interface and it comes back to whoever the discrepancy agency is, what is your process for resolving that, right? What is your process for resolving any discrepancies within 3 business days? Have that process documented somewhere and have people prepared and have a backup, right? Because that's also really important, is identifying who is your backup. Understanding that validations on your NG911 data. Look, if you guys are going with a vendor, whether it's us, whether it's Geocom, whether it's whoever your vendor is, whoever's cleaning up your GIS data, you have to understand that the minute that data comes into your hand, it's already out of date, right? Like you're continually adding to your data, you're making changes within your data. What are you going to do to keep that data compliant? Because every time that you add in an address, that could potentially change your road centerline range, right? And so what things are affected by that? So you have to kind of be thinking about that and say, okay, well, here's my NG911 data validation schedule, and you're going to have that implemented in your environment as well. Strategic planning. This is a shameless plug for myself because I want to work with you. I want to get to know you. I want to help you with all of the areas where you're struggling, because I can tell you one of the most rewarding things for me is just being able to sit with you and give you ideas and help you understand that it is easy to attain these goals with a plan. And that's kind of what makes all the difference for a lot of folks. When you have goals, you can collaborate with your different stakeholders, improve that communication, and then you can also leverage educational opportunities as well. And then the strategic planning process involves identifying the appropriate stakeholders. So it's really going to be people who are involved in the addressing process, GIS data management, and public safety process, any of your municipalities, any of those folks gathering information, okay, sitting down, talking to you, coming to visit you on site and in person, getting to know your work environment, and all of the different things that you do day to day are really, really important in this process. Talking to you and understanding what your needs are, because a lot of you already know where your problems are, right? You already know and understand where you have issues in your workflow or within your data management, or maybe you have staffing concerns. A lot of these things you're already aware of. But then we also take a look at your data. We can do a gap analysis on that and let you know, okay, well, here's where your data is currently. Here's what's required for NG911 standards, and then here's what you need to do to get to that point, okay? So we work with you through that, and then we can also give you some really good recommendations for future needs for NG 911, and also just to meet your general GIS goals. So that's kind of what the strategic planning process looks like. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk, because I know I am. So let me go to the chat or to the Q&A.
So the first question there comes from Brian Bond in Arizona, and he says, you mentioned having separate property access points for a rural area.
Mm-hmm.
Is this data only for the computer-aided dispatch or for the NG lists and ECRF?
Yeah, so that's not a required layer for NG 911. So your required layers are your address points, your road center lines, your provisioning boundary, and then your call routing boundaries, which are your PSAP, and then your service boundaries for fire, police, and EMS. And I'm trying to get used to the new verbiage, because in the new release of the what is it, the GIS data model, I think the new release of that document, it's actually going to be service boundaries, not emergency service boundaries. And then also law is changing, just so you know. So those are the core GIS layers that are required for NG 911. But definitely from the CAD perspective, as much information as you can provide to your call takers, to your first responders, that's why I recommended that, especially in rural areas, because you're basically giving them more information, right? Any suggestions on how to deal with situations where new learning would be required because driveway is more than one or three structures in the driveway is all on private property? Well, I mean, so the way that we handled that, Michelle, in our community was, I mean, our road names, you know, we would enforce that for 911, but we would pay for the sign, and we never had an issue putting up a sign. That was never an issue for us. So I would have to dig into that a little bit more, because truthfully, this is the first time that I've heard that private property, there might be a signage issue. We never experienced that where I worked. So I can dig into that a little bit more. Streets. From the public safety angle, is there a standard for consistently determining the cross streets to a given incident location? John, did you have much experience with managing we manage the cross streets, but to be truthful, in an NG 911 environment, cross streets are not part of the data model. But that's not to say that they are not required for your CAD system. So John, do you have any experience with that?
We would include them in, say, the linear routing network for CAD and AVL, but would exclude them out of the, you know, we wouldn't put any road ranges or road names on the cross streets. And so that still gave you the functionality in AVL, but it cleaned up your data. You didn't have these short little segments of road that, you know, may have an arbitrary name or an arbitrary range, you know, 1 to 2, just because it's a cross street. So that's kind of how we handled it. Guys, we've got about 2 more minutes here. I don't know that we'll get through all of the questions, but we do have your questions and your contacts, so we will follow up with you. We'll try to get as many of these questions answered here live, but we need to wrap up the session in about 2 minutes here. So
that's when we start playing like the Mario music, where you run out of time at the end and it gets all fast and you get anxiety. Okay. So Dick, I'm not sure about the LBRS. I would have to do some research on that. So I'm sorry, I can't give any feedback on that right now, because I haven't really been involved with anything in Ohio. So if cities refuse to correct a terrible address, if you are the addressing authority, then I would say, you know, you have the power, and you should hopefully have some ordinances that support your authority. But in terms of if it's a city issue, they're a municipality. Again, I think it kind of goes back to education. If you can tell a story where response has been affected because of bad addressing, that definitely tells a story, and helps people to kind of move on that and correct the issues. Okay, Michelle, that's good. Okay, and then The last one from Sarah, is there an example of generic SOP and ordinances? Well, ordinances, there are a lot of ordinances out there. I'm currently developing one for a city but I would just encourage you to do a Google search. I don't know of any offhand that I would say are 100% for NG911, but I would just Google places that that are, solid with their ordinances and see if you can get some ideas. That's kind of what we had to do a long time ago when I worked for the city. And then you have to run them by your attorney and all that good stuff. Okay, is there anybody else?
I've got a couple questions that I jotted down out of the chat, and guys, I promise you we will follow up with these questions and get back to you there. I'm going ahead and copy the chat window and started highlighting stuff. So I apologize to cut it short here, but we have other presentations coming up. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We had over 145 attendees to Annie's presentation, and such great comment and dialogue in the chat window there. It was a really great presentation. Annie, thank you for presenting, and thank everyone for joining. And please join us for our next presentation. Starting here, let's see. I think we put it in the chat window there with the link and where you could join the next presentation. Yes, it is in the chat window. So please join us for the next one, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.